Welcome to Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how US government policy will affect your bottom line long after the presidential polls have closed. Wrapping up the weekend with that DNC convention and that speech from Vice President Kamala Harris. A lot of people wondering, were we going to see Beyonce or Taylor? Were they going to headline? That didn't end up being the headline there. But what's important is, having skirted months of campaigning, people wanted to see a little more meat on the bones on the policy. So we'll break down what we heard from there in this rite of passage, in this shorter than expected speech. So today we're going to be looking forward, though, what we heard from this policy, what these plans mean for the nation, and of course breaking down the speech with that emphasis on foreign policy that we saw as well. So first of all, of course, want to get the breakdown with my co-stars, Ben Werschkul and Rick Newman. First, of course, Ben, want to start with you. What's on your note card this week?
My note card right here for you, Rachelle. Yeah, I think that, Beyonce notwithstanding, I think the bottom line from this week is this was a week that kind of couldn't have gone better for Democrats if they tried. There was no significant protest. They had clearly a really amped up party faithful. And what I think the initial reviews are of a highly effective speech from Kamala Harris last night. So that's sort of this week. What we did learn this week was a whole lot of new economic policy. She gave a speech a week ago on a cost of living plan. We didn't get a lot new there. So that's a big question going forward. One issue I did write about this morning was about housing as an important theme in the Democratic speech. You heard it multiple times with Harris last night, and you heard it from a lot of other speakers this week, including Barack Obama. And so I think that's sort of an issue to watch as a top tier issue for voters, but also one that could be a real policy discussion perhaps in 2025.
Hey, Rachelle, I thought you were going to call Ben and me your colleagues, but you called us your co-stars. I feel like I've been upgraded. Thank you.
Of
course. My first number one takeaway from Kamala Harris' speech at the convention, she was on time. Thank you very much. And she only spoke for 40 minutes, and Trump was 92 minutes, so she was less than half the time as Trump. And thank you, guys. Less is more. I think we should all vote for politicians who give the shortest speeches. The shorter your speech, the more likely we are going to be to vote for you. So as for takeaways, this we now have the table stakes. Kamala Harris, joyful warrior. They made that point. Donald Trump, we know, old and angry. Everything is a hellscape. So now we're gonna get beyond the pomp and circumstance and get into the nitty-gritty of the last 75 days. It's going to be really interesting to watch. My sense is, more than usual, this election is going to be a popularity contest. I mean, I think to some extent it always is, but I think more this time. And I'm not, we are going to get a little bit more from Kamala Harris in terms of policy. I'm not sure voters are just going to pay that much attention to it this time around.
We'll certainly have to see. And of course, we want to bring in our guest here to help break some of this down, Ed Mills, Raymond James Managing Director, to join this discussion here. As Rick was mentioning, we've had all the razzle-dazzle of the conventions. How much meat on the bones did you see in terms of policies and things that you really wanted to hear out of Kamala Harris?
Yeah, Rachelle, I was left wanting more. I got some. The way I break down the speech last night, it was kind of four parts. Number one, introducing herself to the country, kind of trying to have that second time to make a first impression. Number two, prosecuting the case against Trump. Third, a little bit on the domestic policy. What was really interesting to me was, Rick you highlighted the focus on housing. There was not the focus on price gouging, giving the FTC more actions. That was pretty unpopular when it came out, or that's where she got the most pushback. So that wasn't in. And then probably the most meat on the bones was number four, which is Kamala Harris as potential commander-in-chief. For the first time that I have seen her, she really outlined some of her foreign policy views and how she would litigate her kind of time as a potential commander-in-chief, and how she would lead the armed services and work with our allies, and really trying to build a contrast between what she would do and what a future second term of Donald Trump would look like.
She actually talked more about foreign policy in her speech than she did about economics by my count. So I'm going to make an observation. I'll ask you, Ed, first, and then Rachelle, Ben, tell me what you think. I thought she seemed presidential in her speech. Ed, what did you think?
Yeah, I think that was the goal of the speech, was to kind of anyone who kind of was questioning whether or not she was up for the job, trying to establish a seriousness and to talk about some of the issues that are really important to voters. I do think that the Trump campaign has really focused on three things: inflation, the border, and geopolitical events. She also highlighted what she would do on the border. So we should talk about that. But on geopolitical events, she really wanted to send this strong message of standing with Israel, calling Hamas a terrorist organization, but also recognizing the human rights issues with the Palestinian people, talking about her role in meeting with Zelensky 5 days before Putin invaded Ukraine, and discussing how she has met with 150 world leaders since she has ascended to the role as vice president, trying to make the case that what is probably the area of her background that is the least fleshed out, which is on kind of geopolitical and national security, that she would be ready to take on that role on day one. I do think that's going to be increasingly something that Republicans try to criticize and say that she's not ready. So she wanted to kind of go on the offensive on what might be a potential liability for her as we get closer to November, Rick.
Ben Werschkul, did you think she seemed presidential, or does she have some work to do?
It's kind of the goal of all of these nominating speeches is to sort of create an impression that you can understand this person in your living room for the next 4 years. So I think that's definitely in the reviews I've seen as sort of what was highly effective about it.
And it's interesting because one of the criticisms sometimes that you hear from people is about her role as a prosecutor, saying, that she came across too hard, and other times like, oh, she's smiling too much or not smiling enough. I think she really just let herself define herself. We really got to see her in her element here, and even tying that thread through being a prosecutor and really framing that as being a protector in chief, sort of a protector when it came to sort of women's rights. And so I think she laid the groundwork here pretty well. But for investors, though, what do they care about from these speeches, Ed?
Yeah, so for investors, what we've been telling folks at Raymond James since the beginning of the year is that as we game out some of the probabilities, when you add up the percentage probability of a Republican sweep and a Democratic sweep, that's the most likely outcome. That has a greater than 50% chance. And when there is a sweep by either party, that unlocks what we call reconciliation. And it's kind of boring to talk about reconciliation. It just happens to be what we've made all of the major policy changes under our government in the last 30 years. And we look ahead and say, all right, if there is reconciliation under a Republican sweep, what does that mean for the extension of the tax cuts? The Inflation Reduction Act, the signature achievement of the Biden administration, is that under threat? Are there going to be impacts to industrial stocks? Is there going to be impact to clean energy stocks? If there were to be a Democratic sweep, is that corporate tax rate going up? Is that going to impact some of the companies that are that top rate payer? And another really important kind of conversation coming out of this is which policies would be more inflationary. I think the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of folks has been Democrats, especially because we've had inflation during the Biden administration and a lot of fiscal stimulus, could continue policies that could bring about a second wave of inflation. But as I look at some of what Trump is proposing, from tariffs to kind of higher deficits to stricter immigration, those are all inflationary pressure. So there's a lot of conversation as to those fiscal policies, how that could impact monetary policy, and is it an easier path ahead if the Fed has a Harris presidency versus a Trump presidency, or because especially if they try to wait to understand exactly what a President Trump would do on a number of those policies that he's proposed on the campaign trail.
So, Ed, I want to ask you about a couple of specific Kamala Harris policies. And one thing we try to do on this show is figure out what can people safely ignore. In other words, the policy ideas that are really just kind of the silly ones that have almost no likelihood of actually happening. So to my mind, there are at least two that Kamala Harris has proposed that really are not going to turn into anything. One of them is some way to prevent price fixing. She talks mostly about food, but that would be, I guess that you would extend that to housing and other areas. So price fixing or something against price gouging. And then the $25,000 subsidy for first-time home buyers, which would have to happen through congressional legislation. I think there's on the $25,000. I think there's almost no chance Congress would pass that under any scenario because it's kind of a dumb idea, bad idea. And then on the price fixing, I just don't see how you do anything. So am I reading that wrong, or do you think people can kind of put these ones off to the side?
Yeah, Rick, I guess the thing I've told folks at Raymond James about the down payment assistance is that was actually part of the Build Back Better plan. There were housing provisions that passed the House of Representatives that
means it failed to pass when Democrats had full
control. It failed to pass,
of Congress.
So Rick, it only passes if there were to be a Democratic sweep.
But it could. I mean, it could pass in a Democratic sweep scenario.
Yeah, I think it was one of the things that, as I talked to folks within the housing industry, they were really optimistic about getting that at the beginning of the Biden administration. And they were somewhat shocked that the entire housing portion of Build Back Better was completely left on the sidelines. And so it's how it's structured. And I do think that there is such a concern about the gap in home ownership based upon your wealth, based upon your race, that Democrats really want to focus on. Lots of potential unintended consequences, but I agree with you that we shouldn't think that this is likely right now. But if there was a Democratic sweep, I'd have to kind of watch this closely. I think there would be something on housing and something on down payment assistance in the final package.
What about price fixing? Is there anything realistically she can do?
I think that would be very difficult. I think I would be looking more to see who is in charge of the FTC. Lena Khan's term ends here this year. She can stick around as long as the president hasn't appointed and the Senate hasn't confirmed her replacement. But I would say across the board on all regulation, it doesn't matter who wins. The Supreme Court and the judiciary has really fundamentally changed the powers of regulators with some of the precedents set this session. So anything that's aggressive from a regulator, I discount right now because of the throwing out of what we call the Chevron deference and the higher hurdle that regulators have. But where I would say that price fixing or that focus would come into play is, there was a deal a couple of weeks ago here with Mars buying Kellanova, two companies in the food space trying to come together. Deal approval is probably where you see that get impacted because there is a concern, and it's a populist concern. It's not a Democrat or a Republican concern. It is that those companies with their market power are shrinking, what they provide you and causing those prices to go up. So I don't think you'll have new price gouging laws, but is it going to be a tougher approval process on M&A? That's how I'd view it from a market perspective, Rick.
For sure, and I think that when you listen to Harris speak, that's kind of the tension we're seeing right now, is that they talk about it as one thing, it gets kind of portrayed as Soviet-style price gouging, but it's not that. I also want to ask you, Ed, about other stuff we didn't see in the speech. I was sort of taken a bit by how little China came up. I searched the transcript, and the word China was only uttered one time, and then there was a kind of mentions of tariffs. Climate change was another one that didn't come up, and you mentioned price gouging, how that didn't come up much directly in the speech at all. Curious kind of which of those are significant to you, and what does that tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've spent the last 8 years kind of almost daily on the U.S.-China policy. And it's probably one of the true bipartisan issues that remain in Washington, D.C. I think what we saw when I've talked to folks kind of politically here in D.C. is that Biden hasn't always kind of used it too much in his speeches, partly because if you get into this fight, are you going to out-China Trump? And it probably puts it more onto his playing field. I go into the kind of bucket of, in politics, when you're explaining, you're losing. So she wanted to focus on a small number of issues, really focus on kind of getting the American people to know her. So anything that was potentially an advantage that, or kind of a maybe something that would be a stalemate in a debate, don't focus on that. Focuses on areas that you have a strong advantage with, and don't go into things that you already have your base with you. So on climate change, I think that would be one of those issues. It's actually pretty notable that a Democratic nominee didn't focus on that, because I do think they were trying to get those swing voters. But I think if she were to be pushed on that, she would go to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the single largest investment in clean energy in the history of the world. So she would have a pretty quick comeback there, Ben.
So, Ed, for normal people who care about this but have busy lives,
we're not normal.
No, we're not. We're political geeks, I think.
Okay.
Fair to say.
Hardly.
I mean, look at what I've got in front of me here. So what are the things to focus on during the next 75 days? What are the things that could possibly move the needle? We've got a debate on September 10th. Trump is going to be sentenced in the New York case where he was guilty of 34 fraud counts. Those are a couple things. What do people really need to be thinking about in terms of what's going to determine the outcome here?
Yeah, so what we've highlighted all year is that, this is an election that's been decided by known unknowns and unknown unknowns. This is a really close election at this point, and, it easily could break in one direction or another. What I've told folks at Raymond James to focus on is not on those national polls, but on the kind of state level polls and how do you get to 270 electoral college votes. I've been focused a lot on Pennsylvania because, Democrats could win in Arizona, win in Michigan, win in Wisconsin, and then Kamala Harris would be at 268 electoral college votes. So trying to figure out the coalition that gets either side over 270. The debates are going to be really important. I'm watching here, too, to the extent as is there a convention bounce for Harris or has Harris peaked? Trump peaked as he took the stage in his acceptance nomination in Milwaukee. Has Harris done the same? Normally in conventions, you get the bounce after the convention because you use the convention to really bring your base together. We've had the base really come together for Democrats over the last month after the switcheroo with Joe Biden. And so was there a pull forward in that? And if she has peaked, I think that's where people will really start moving their odds back to Trump. But if she continues this momentum, people really start moving their odds towards Harris. And then the conversation about Congress and could she move that momentum into a Democratic sweep? I don't think the market has started pricing in those tax changes or policy changes that a Democratic sweep would bring about.
Certainly still a long road to November. Appreciate you taking the time to join us. Ed Mills, Raymond James Managing Director, thank you so much.
That was great, Ed. Thank you.
We're heading for a quick break here on Capital Gains. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Capital Gains. Want to bring back my co-stars Rick and Ben to really get a feel for what we should be focusing on. I know you love being a co-star.
Co-stars.
What we'll be focusing on. That's right, in these coming days. So, I want to talk about one of the things that she mentioned, that Kamala Harris mentioned, which was the opportunity economy. And it really did seem to be this sort of hodgepodge of things. It was sort of labor, entrepreneurs, access to capital, also talked about, Social Security, Medicare. What do you think is going to be the most important thing to focus on between now and election time? Ben, if you want to kick it off.
For sure. Yeah, no, I agree with you that there's a hodgepodge. I had another note card for you, which had 7 additional planks of the Harris opportunity economy we haven't heard sort of specific details on. So there's
Ben,
a lot
you should provide that to the Harris campaign because I think you're more organized.
Well,
I think you have a better grasp of their plan than they do.
Yeah. So the one I would focus on for sure is the childcare aspects of this. That's a definite priority for Harris. That's the one that I think is clearly going to be a plan we're going to see at some point in the coming weeks. Childcare, long-term paid leave, all these issues that have been a long-term priority for her. This is a big plank for her, so it's going to be a big part. It's also going to be an expensive plank, presumably, depending on what the details are. So that's a big one I'd be watching.
So I thought Kamala Harris. I think she's really done. I'm very surprised that she has. It's been a pretty seamless takeover from Joe Biden, and I can't really think of a single mistake she has made so far. Now she hasn't really been tested under pressure yet, but when I hear this phrase, the opportunity economy, I feel like somebody was like, "We need a label for our plan. Let's ask ChatGPT to give us a bland milk toasty kind of label." I have no idea what opportunity economy means. I think Democrats, for as long as I can remember, the one thing that Donald Trump has brought out in relief compared with Democrats is he's just so much better at branding. I don't know what opportunity is, and so I think she really needs to do this for the next 75 days. There are some dumb ideas here that, however, that seem to work on the campaign trail. Going after price gouging is one of them. I think when you mentioned some of these plans are going to be costly, I don't think it matters. I think people want to hear, are there going to be child care benefits? I just want the benefit. I really don't care about if it adds to the deficit. So I'm just looking for more clarity on what her plan really is, and especially communicating it through some crisp branding. I don't know if Democrats can pull that off.
They're doing a good job of at least communicating and appealing to younger voters. Obviously, they're going for a lot of these viral moments, I noticed. Whether that actually pans out and translates into young votes, I'm not really sure. But I didn't actually mind the branding of opportunity economy, because I think both conventions are really going for this sort of inclusive, sort of heal the country and politics in that sense. And I think it almost is like a catch-all. And I thought it was interesting that she went with that versus trying to call it Kamalanomics or something else, because it did seem to perhaps tap into some people who felt a bit disenfranchised or perhaps, left out of the conversation there. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think bland political slogans have existed long before AI, so it doesn't take AI to come up with.
Humans
with
are
these
just
kind of
as
things.
bad sometimes. Yeah, most of the time.
Yeah, One takeaway from opportunity economy for me is that there's an element, I think, in there of a business world focus, that this is about entrepreneurs. That's what she talks about in her plans a lot. It's about giving people an opportunity. It's about giving small businesses as an element of her overall vision. So I think that's one part of it for the business world to watch. My overall take on it is that there's kind of two categories of proposals here. There's the headline stuff that's popular, but maybe doesn't make sense economically. I would put price gouging, maybe this $25,000 credit for housing, no taxes on tips is another one in there. And then there's other stuff in there that's popular still, but I think will launch a conversation and be a priority for next year, no matter what. The child tax credit is up there. There's other stuff in the housing plan. I do think of an idea of a tax credit for home builders to build first-time homes is interesting. I don't know how that works. I don't know how you do that, but that's an interesting idea that I think we'll keep talking about. And then prescription drugs is another one that Harris has already talked a lot about, and the government can do a lot on. So there's stuff in there that's maybe perhaps under the radar that's going to be a actual policy perhaps down the road.
We didn't talk about RFK dropping out. I know we only have just a quick minute left. Does that change the dynamic in any way, Rick?
Yeah, it seems like it does for the time being. So the analysis suggests that is, let's assume he's going to endorse Trump, because I think he just wants to keep getting attention, and he wants to make a play for some kind of role in a Trump administration. So far, it looks like that might benefit Trump a little bit. So because his voters would be a little more likely to go to Trump than to go to Kamala Harris. But that's today, and 2.5 months from now, is anybody even going to remember RFK Jr.? I'm not sure. And the number one thing I'm thinking of is what is going to be the real determinant of this election. It's really, really close right now. And you cannot predict based on any trend that one or the other, Trump or Harris, is ahead. So we've got the debate coming up on September 10th. I think that is going to get a massive audience. The real question is whether Kamala Harris, the prosecutor, is going to be able to do a takedown of Trump, or is Trump going to find some effective way to lob all of his criticisms at her about the open border and all the hyperbole and some of the lies. So we're going to see a lot of that. That is going to be a fascinating debate. It's going to be so much more interesting than if it were Biden versus Trump, too.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure we'll all be keeping tune of that. And of course, I'm sure Yahoo Finance will bring you all the highlights as we do. Thanks for watching Capital Gains with myself, Rachelle Akuffo, Ben Werschkul, and Rick Newman. We'll see you next time.